Specific deterrence. This focuses on the offender. The view is that criminal sanctions should be so powerful that offenders will never repeat their criminal acts. That's the goal here of specific deterrence. Offenders face the pain of the punishment the first time, and then lesson learned, right? The second time around results in a harsher sentence. But unfortunately, the research suggests that this is not the case. The research has mixed views whether a harsher sentence is effective in deterring offenders from reoffending. So why are they more likely to reoffend? Well, because now they have a criminal record. It's hard to get a job. They end up returning to the location where the crime happened. Some believe that crime's worth doing. And some say that punishment breeds defiance. Offenders can show that, well, the system didn't beat me. I'm not going to be beaten by the system. And then there's the stigma of being locked up. People label you, society labels an offender, as a criminal. So they're likely to return to that life of crime. So specific deterrence. We had general deterrence, we had specific deterrence. Another area that is used to deter crime, incapacitation. Actually, before I forget, there's a video on the Moodle site to take a look with regards to incapacitation, which equals incarceration. So does confining dangerous criminals eliminate the risk of their repeating their offense in society? That is the question raised by incapacitation. The goal is to keep dangerous criminals out of society, therefore the crime rate should go down. Or you just lock up people who are in their prime of their criminal careers, and they'll age out, and that's going to reduce crime over their lifetime. Does that make sense? That's the thinking with regards to these goals for incapacitation. The strength of this approach recognizes the role opportunity plays in criminal behavior, meaning that if the offender is off the streets, their opportunities to commit crime are greatly reduced. Also, incarceration provides a solution to chronic offending. You just lock them up. The big question is, though, can this really reduce crime? The approach is certainly effective at keeping the offender out of circulation while they're serving time, which certainly reduces their own criminal involvement. However, studies have not supported a strict incarceration policy. There's no compelling evidence that imprisonment substantially increases or decreases the likelihood of subsequent criminal involvement. Some of the support against incarceration points to these rationales. The more times a person is incarcerated, the higher their chances are of repeat offending each subsequent time, and in shorter duration from release. So as soon as they're released, they're committing a crime. So the longer they're incarcerated and then they get out, the shorter time it takes for reoffending. Criminal labeling as an ex-con prevents individuals from successfully gaining legitimate occupations and employment in many sectors of the economy, which in some instances becomes the rationale the criminal uses to commit more crime. There's always someone to take the place of an incarcerated offender. Just because we lock up a particular drug dealer that's at a particular corner selling drugs does not mean there is no one else who could sell drugs on that corner. New people will recruit, and presumably there'll be crime or drug activity at that particular location. So there's always a replacement, right? The cost of incarceration is terribly expensive, costing well into the tens of thousands of millions of dollars each year. I checked in New York State, it costs for one person being incarcerated in New York State $60,000 a year to have to take care of that one person, the cost of incarcerating that one person. So, is it worth it? Here is a summary of our topics that we covered: the rational choice theory, general deterrence, specific deterrence, and incapacitation. I'll leave this slide for your review. It condenses all that material into this nice chart. Let's talk about criminal justice and the rational choice theory. So our criminal justice system, right? The rational choice theory, despite its mixed research, has had an impact on the criminal justice system. What's our criminal justice system? The cops, the courts, and corrections. So how does the rational choice theory impact law enforcement? More recent research shows that adding more police to patrol, i.e. those guardians, more likely that someone is caught. The technologies that are available now to law enforcement allows the police to be more effective in catching criminals. Police departments also implement things like crackdowns, which means they focus on a particular area of crime to target, such as we're going to target, drug sales in the community, or weapon possession. That was big in New York State when the SAFE Act was passed. They targeted weapon possession and actually got grant money for that too, law enforcement agencies. Another approach, which is commonly used, is the focused deterrence, or another name for it is pulling levers policing. These are problem-oriented policing strategies that follow the principles of the deterrence theory. The strategies, they target specific criminal behavior committed by a small number of chronic offenders who are vulnerable to sanctions and punishment, which means they might be on probation, or they might be facing a very big sentence if they've got a criminal record. So what happens is offenders are directly confronted and informed by law enforcement that continued criminal behavior will not be tolerated. These targeted offenders are also told how the criminal justice system, such as the police and the prosecutors, will respond to continued criminal behavior. Mainly that they'll pull out all stops. All the potential sanctions, all the levers, everything will be applied in making arrests, enforcing those probation restrictions, which might be curfew violation, as little as you're out an hour later than you're supposed to be. The deterrence-based message is reinforced through crackdowns on offenders or groups of offenders, such as gang members, who continue to commit crimes despite these warnings. So in addition to deterring violent behavior, the strategies also reward compliance and nonviolent behavior among these targeted offenders by providing positive incentives, such as access to job opportunities or resources available through social services. The focused deterrence strategies generally target, like I said, a specific type of group of offenders, such as youth gang members or repeat violent offenders. Some strategies have focused on eliminating public forums, such as drug dealing, the street markets, crack houses, like actual places. These strategies are known as drug market interventions, and they work by warning the dealers and the buyers and their families that enforcement is going to be imminent. So the first step that happens in all of this is law enforcement lays down that warning, and then if nothing happens, they will pull out all their stops to enforce the law. So how does the rational choice theory impact the courts? Well, the fact that punishment may deter criminals from committing crimes, that has shaped what our sentencing laws are today. And we have several different sentencing laws, but the two primary ones that focus on folks who keep repeating their criminal conduct because they haven't learned, they haven't been deterred, is mandatory sentencing. It's a statutory required penalty that must be imposed and carried out upon a conviction. It's another way of curbing judicial discretion too. Like it's a real get tough on crime, meaning a judge has no discretion when the statute says if you commit, selling drugs, a certain amount of narcotic controlled substance drugs, you're going to prison. The statute says you're going to prison for 5 years. It could say that. That's a mandatory sentence. You must go to prison for this long. Versus you can go to prison up to 5 years. When you hear words like that, the judge has this huge range of like, oh, well, maybe no time in prison to, up to 5 years in prison. So that gives the court discretion. With mandatory sentences, the statute lays down what's going to happen if you do this particular crime. The other law we have is this 3 strikes rule. Most states provide a lengthy prison term for anyone convicted of 3 or more felonies. Usually 1 or more of those felonies has to be a violent felony in order for that to happen. And I will say courts are generally required to hold a hearing before they actually impose the 3 strikes rule. And the 3 strikes rule in most states says the maximum time you can receive is 25 to life. The minimum is 12 to life. The maximum is 25 years to life. And that's what the law is in New York State. They call it the persistent felony offender. So if a criminal has 2 prior felonies, and let's say they are assault. Let's say they have 2 assault cases. When you assault somebody, let's say they used a bat, you assault somebody with a bat in the state of New York, that's a violent crime, that's mandatory prison, that has a mandatory prison sentence to it. Let's say there's 2 of those on this person's record, and now they have committed a third, let's say it's nonviolent, let's say it's drug sales, but it's still a felony, controlled substance. They'd be facing, because it's number 3, and one of the prior charges was a violent, they can be facing that persistent felony or the 3 strikes rule, and the court, at least in New York State, can impose a minimum of 12 to life with a maximum of 25 to life. So that's the 3 strikes rule. And there's a lot of opinions with regards to whether or not that works or not, a little outside the scope of what we're going to talk about. So how does the rational choice theory impact corrections? There are a number of correction policies that intend to send a message that crime doesn't pay, to the simple things of like no good time, you have to serve your whole sentence. But primarily, there are supermax prisons where an inmate, an offender, is in lockdown in a cell for 23 hours a day. They have minimal communication with other inmates or anyone in general, and they get no benefits. There's no extra benefits that some criminals do have when they're in a prison system. Does that deter crime? For repeat offenders, we're just going to lock you up in a supermax. So one last point that I want to, so that's how the rational choice system affects our criminal justice system. And deterrence. Clearly our criminal justice system has used deterrence and punishment with lengthy incarceration for those who repeat as a form of, or an attempt form to deter crime. And if you can't be deterred, then you're just going to be locked up using incapacitation. So watch that video on incapacitation. It's only a few minutes long. This week's assignment for the forum post involves informal sanctions. I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now, but there'll be more information on Moodle and the assignment. Informal versus formal sanctions. Informal is a form of shaming and humiliation. Morality, shame, humiliation. The idea is that there are other options to reduce or discourage crime besides formal sanctions. Formal sanctions are all of the legal outcomes and consequences that you can endure if you get caught for a crime. But research is suggesting that informal sanctions can have an effective impact as well. Informal sanctions, these are the unofficial punishments that are associated with things like shame and guilt, and typically they are exerted by our loved ones, family, friends, significant others, the community. And what it does is it makes how one feel, right? There's a disapproval from someone you love. You might feel shame, you might feel guilty, there might be some remorse, you might be embarrassed. These informal sanctions, they expand the range of negative consequences beyond what the state can do officially. Many vary according to the community structure and the type of crime. Informal sanctions can enhance the impact and outcome of formal sanctions. And these techniques have been shown to work pretty well. Not for everyone. I say not for everyone because there are some people who have nothing to lose, and they're just not impacted by how others view them or their actions. But adding this shame component, I haven't seen it in this area being used. There are states who use it, and I've put examples on Moodle. There's a video, an article, and some photographs of how it works. But shame is a powerful tool of informal social control as opposed to formal social control. This is where you shame and humiliate somebody in a public setting, and that may deter crime. And there are more, and like I said, there are more and more used around this country for a variety of crimes, from people being outed for prostitution or drug areas. Some folks are wearing signs on a street corner that says, "Hey, I shoplift at this place." So the point is to use shame and humiliation to impact and control behavior. Some sort, like stigma. Anyhow, take a look at that information in the forum post. The question is going to be, do you think shaming would be an effective deterrent to others? Why do or don't you like it as a form of punishment? So watch that few-minute video, read the article, and check out the photographs of people who had to wear signs in public, kind of outing themselves, and tell me what you think.